behalf of INYAS family, I welcome all our guests in the panel discussion. The panel discussion topic, as you know, is very important and relevant specifically to all young scientists. The topic is to discuss on science performance indices, need, rationale, and alternatives. For this particular panel discussion, we have with us Professor Sandeep Verma, Secretary SERB-DST, Government of India. We have with us Professor Ramgopal Rao from IIT Delhi. We have with us Professor Gaiti Hasan, NCBS, Vice President INSA. We have with us Dr. Deeksha Gupta, Associate Director from SES India, and Professor Chandra Sharma, Chair INYAS. So with this, I would like to request Dr. Chagun to moderate this session. Dr. Chagun, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Basha. I think the session today is going to discuss one of the most important aspects of scientific ecosystem, not just limited to Indian science. First, let me take a few minutes to introduce the topic of the panel, and then we have the panelists who would let us go into the direction of the conversation that we would like to have in this topic. As Dr. Basha mentioned about science performance indices, the need, the relevance, the rationality of using those indices in performance evaluation, and then is there a need to go for alternatives? And to begin with, if we want to just briefly explain what we mean by performance indices, I think there is a huge gap in the terms of understanding what role monitoring and evaluation play in doing science in general. Is the sound, the volume high enough for everyone to hear?
It's better now.
Better.
No, it is okay.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep this closer to my lips so that I think it's I'll probably just highlight few thoughts that I have before we dwell into some of the direct questions that we would like to have our panelists to answer in terms of their opening remarks, and then we'll go into the discussion. As in terms of logistics, we will have 3 segments in the session. The first one will be an introduction to the topic, followed by initial remarks by the panelists that we have. And then the next segment of 25 minutes will be about discussing on some of the aspects of the topic. And then the last segment, 25 minutes, will be about taking Q&A from audience who are engaging both in YouTube channel as well as in the Zoom chat box here. And those who are watching live on YouTube, please feel free to write your comments and questions, and our online moderators are taking it up and they'll bring it up to the panel here. In terms of performance indices, I think in one way or the other, everyone who is listening to this have gone through some form of evaluation in our scientific ecosystem. As everybody says, science is not limited to a boundary, be it a geographical boundary or any kind of sectoral boundaries. But however, the way it is measured and monitored and evaluated differs in various segments. However, the evaluation parameters that we see today, be it individual scientists, be it research group, or be it institutional evaluation, nationally, internationally, they all follow certain kind of indices, indicators, composite indicators, scoreboards, and some of the controversial indicators as well, which many a times we don't want to accept that they are controversial because we end up being part of those indicator formation itself. And as the composition of the panel says, indices are used in different levels of decision making. And one important point that I'd like to say here before we ask our panelists to give their initial remarks is the importance of performance evaluation is little more than what we would like to openly accept probably and imagine. And many times it is not just transparency or ethical conduct of performance evaluation. It is more than how as individual peers within the scientific ecosystem, we try to see those indicators and take judgmental call on individuals and research outputs and scientific productivity as a whole. With that open thought, let me pose individual questions to our panelists. As a response to that, I'd request them to give their opening remarks for 4 to 5 minutes. Let me begin with our first panelist, Professor Sandeep Verma, Secretary of SERB, one of the leading extramural funding agencies of the country. Professor Verma, what do you think the importance of performance evaluation? I know it's a no-brainer question, but I think to begin with, we need to build some foundation. Why do we need to evaluate at all?
Thank you very much, Dr. Basha. I think I would like to start by thanking INYAS for arranging this panel on a question that is so relevant to all of us who pursue active research. And of course, the performance matters, and a lot of decision making that goes around and behind the scenes depends on how well we have performed. So having said this, let me build a case that performance really not necessarily is being used these days to judge an individual, as you pointed out, individual. But I would like to sort of gravitate away from an individual. And I share that even institutions these days, when you look at NIRF, when you look at institutions of eminence, they all have come through a very rigorous performance selection, how well an institution has performed. So not just individual, we are now looking at the national level, even at the global level, when you look at world rankings, right? There is some kind of, judgment based on quantities, based on qualitative measurements, where you take, inputs by sending questionnaires to leading academicians. How do you feel about a certain university? So it is now all pervasive. The performance outcome frameworks are now well developed, looking at institutions, looking at a department level, looking at university level, individual level. So we are not going to get away from how we are going to be judged. That is point number one. Point number two is that when we are looking at a limited set of resources, and it is, again, as you point out, no brainer. So I'm not saying anything which is not obvious to all of us, that for limited set of resources, if everybody has to compete there, you have to draw a line somewhere where which is going to be dictated by a judicious thought, and not being biased in any shape or form, right? You are looking at an individual or an institution, either it is one of those centrally funded institutions or institutions which do not have that kind of right resources that as many other institutions have. So we have to have frameworks that allow us to judge people, judge their science, judge their research, judge their output. It could be in the form of very many, parameters that we all know of, publication, patents, etc. But at the end of the day, we have to also bring in some form of qualitative measure rather than sheer quantities that is going to judge a person. So I take a very simple analogy of what we have seen so far. So we were having physical meetings, then we had to switch over to virtual meetings. But now everybody talks about hybrid meeting concept, right? So I would like to think at some point of time, we would have to gravitate away from the journal impact factors, Indices, and all other performance indices, which are in vogue, which are primarily driven at times by commercial requirement. If we have Dr. Deeksha Gupta from ACS, right? So journals, they also claim the journal impact factors as being superior over the other publications. And that also, it plays at the back of our mind, right? Even as a researcher, it plays at the back of our mind. So can we think of hybrid models where quantities, moving away from JIF, which exists since early 60s, to Hirsch Index, which started around, say 20 years back or so. Are we now at the crossroads of judgment where we can bring different concepts to judge people, judge science, and make sure that the taxpayers' money or the money being invested in teaching, research, and all other activities, even having a startup. So you fund a lot of startups, but how you judge a startup? How do you judge their performance? So it will have to be thought of very carefully. And I think you have the right panel to take us all forward. And that is my opening remark, and I would come in as and when you ask me to. Thank you, Chagun. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Prof. Verma. I think the foundation is built now as we expected. I think you have also given lead pointers towards other panelists and the questions, and I'm going to take that journal-based impact factors and their dependencies to Dr. Deeksha very soon. Before that, I'd like to pose this question, which I prepared myself from this morning. I was a little uncomfortable posing this, but I'm going to do it. Professor Hasan, it's to you. Uses and abuses of indicators, particularly the quantitative indicators. I mean, from 2 points of view, as an academic, as a senior academic of Indian science, and somebody who represents the collective voice of Indian Academy through the INSA, how do you evaluate the ratio of uses and abuses of such performance indicators and various decision making, particularly in Indian context?
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question. And, I have been working hard at trying to get most decision making of this nature to move away from only using these quantitative performances. So I think the quantitative performances are required, definitely, and I think it's useful in many conditions. So having citation indices or impact factors. But unfortunately, what seems to happen in many cases is that is the only parameter which is used. And I think this is exactly what Professor Sandeep Verma was referring to, that we need to move to a hybrid model. We really need to understand that this is just a small aspect of a person's ability to do well in research. There are many other ways that you can also try and understand how a person does well in research. And for that, you need thought and a broader sort of people who are doing the judging. I just want to give a little historical perspective. You see, when we put in these quantitative performance indices, I would say they were put in about, say, maybe 30 years ago or so. Indian science was very small then. There were not that many people working, especially, and I'm talking more about biology perhaps, okay? There were fewer people. And not everybody there were not experts in every field available. We have grown now, we have grown wonderfully, and, we have all kinds of biologists working in the country and doing very well. So, we need to now expand the way in which we judge people, because we actually have people available to us who can do this kind of judgment, which is earlier, I agree, was not possible. So it was just something, people just used quantitative measures. So I think we really need to move away from pure quantitation to quantity and qualitative. And I can talk more about what I mean by qualitative measures later, perhaps. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. And I think we're going in with clarity into the conversation. Before I call upon Professor Ramgopal Rao to answer and give his opening remarks, I'd like to congratulate him for this illustrious 5 years tenure in IIT Delhi, which recently concluded. Thank you so much for your service, sir. It has been a wonderful time that IIT Delhi has seen with your leadership. With that note, I'm just going to pose something what I was thinking about a little bit deeper about impact-focused alternative evaluation frameworks, which you have been talking about within IIT and IIT councils as well. Recently, IIT Delhi also had PhD students, whether they submit their thesis or not, if they venture into some kind of social innovation or direct entrepreneurial track, that will also be counted as credit for their completion of degree. And that's another kind of performance evaluation at the grad school level itself for PhDs. Like, how do you see impact-focused evaluation when it comes to evaluating anybody doing science, be it PhD student or anyone?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. I think, one of the biggest challenges that we see happening is whatever is easily measurable often becomes a performance indicator. It's as simple as that. Anything that you can measure, then you immediately start attributing a number and then start judging people. I think it's also very often, the fault lies on the people who are judging or sitting on these committees, because we don't want to do all the hard work required. If I have to compare somebody from mechanical and with somebody from electrical sitting on a committee, how would I compare them? They all have written papers in completely different journals. And I can judge the person in electrical, but for the mechanical, I have to count on somebody else. And then their own biases, all of that will come into picture. I personally, haven't been able to figure out any easy way to judge people, across these different disciplines, because, any performance indicator that you think of it, you have to come up with normalization factors. And these normalization factors need to take into account the age disparity, the disciplines. It has to take into account even the country, the institutions. If you can come up with those normalization parameters, then these are all fine. But then it becomes so complex, because if you put in so many multi-variable kind of a thing into judging somebody, then a multi-dimensional space, you are bringing it to a single point, and then all the relevance is lost. So I think finally the onus is on the panel, on the people who are judging candidates. I think if we are aware of what we are looking for example, if I have to judge a faculty member in my area, it's pretty simple for me. But my area is electron devices. If I see 2 CVs, I can only take in 10 minutes, I can tell you who is doing well, who is not doing well, because I have all idea about, those journals and where they are publishing and all of that. But often the problem is this heterogeneity, which creates major issues. So in fact, what you said, therefore, I think defining what is impact, it can be so vastly different, depending on who you ask. For somebody, citations is how they judge the impact. And for me, for example, how much of an impact the work had in that area. But then, the age also comes into picture. When I'm looking at an young person, I don't want to look at too much of an impact and all of that. The societal impact part will come much later. It is one has to grow in the system to have that kind of an impact. So I think for younger people, I would look at where have you published your papers, what kind of journals have you published. That is good enough impact for me. But as you grow older, if I see that you are only publishing papers but nothing else has happened, I would feel disappointed. I would like to see, how has that work translated into something which is of benefit to the community. If you are a technologist, to the society, and if you are a basic science researcher, how much of impact your work has made in that particular space. So I would look at more than just counting the number of papers. So therefore, I think at different ages, the impact would be different. And I think, that's how at least I would look at the impact. But it is never easy. I think we all can point out enough number of laws in the system, but nobody, I can tell you, can come up with a system that is foolproof, that is good, that is acceptable. I think, it's a pretty difficult challenge. So
I completely agree with you, because I think that's probably what adds interest to this panel discussion itself, because if it is an easy matter, we just need a statement to complete it as a solution. When we have illustrious people sitting together and debating, I think that's where we are approaching here. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Moving on to Dr. Deeksha Gupta. This is something related to what Professor Sandeep Verma also touched upon, Dr. Deeksha. I'm just going to put it slightly differently. So there are numerous issues being discussed in the context of commercially minded publishers or publishing houses, as well as a scientific community globally, we having a lot of dependence on journal-based impact factor or journal-based matrices. How do you see this dependence and commercial mindset is doing any favor or injustice to science itself?
Thank you so much, first of all, Dr. Basha and Dr. Sharma for inviting me and having me here. And I'm so glad to be with such esteemed experts here. I think this is a situation like egg and chicken story. I mean, who feed into what? But right now we are at a vicious loop where probably someone who is also part of a responsible publisher, also I consider myself as the part of scientific community. Researchers I think what can make a change is researchers need to be educated about the limitations of all these metrics. And all these metrics were not meant to evaluate and assess scholarly output. They were meant for very different purpose, and started for librarians. How do you identify a journal doing good into the area? And slowly they percolated in system, from some countries or for some communities for different reasons, how they wanted to promote their research, and then it all became like a very trend, all over the countries. And probably people started using it across the world without thinking much if that particular assessment system works for their system, for their country, for their institutions. So I think this is really a time where we are asking questions, and I can dwell a little bit more, about all this impact factor and all these things. So as an individual, I'm not a fan, but I also represent an organization who also don't advocate, but we have to, but we have to be the part of the story, because this is where the whole market is out. But how you can still advocate things in a more healthy fashion. So when it comes to impact factor, it's just like a statistics, right? The number, certain number of citation divided by the number of paper. So there are a lot of factors that goes into, and I can give you some very interesting example. There was an article, the Wakefield Research 1998. It is one of the most cited article, I think, so far, and has been in news for all wrong reasons. It was, the MMR jab and autism and, some other thing, very high on bibliometric number and lately being retracted. Now you imagine, the amount of harm or altogether the misguidance and everything happened, but it was in news like for a long time and a lot of people cited. Similarly, there are examples of phantom references. And I was reading such an interesting story. One Dutch statistician was studying a paper, and he found out one article is cited by 400 papers, never existed. And you know what was the story? It was a template reference by a publisher. A lot of people just put it. They cited it without even knowing it exists because they never researched it. So one of the whistleblower type of organization, Retraction Watch, actually reached out to those people who cited it and asked, what made you to cite this article? And you know what they said? Oh, it was just a mistake. Only 1 out of 400 said, we are planning to work with publisher and correct it. So, the responsibility is on both the side, and researchers need to be made aware of what goes into this calculation and not just go by, the sheer number. It's a lot beyond the number. So I advocate these indicators are just, one criteria which should be the part of the peer review evaluation or the qualitative measures. And there have been so many studies by different groups. So for example, in England, there was a whole lot country level analysis where different institutions came together and they thought, okay, all right, find out a system which is more comprehensive, rigorous, robust, and is going away from, all this disadvantage of this isolated metric system. And they concluded metrics are just indicator. It's like, trying to look from a hole and only seeing the picture other side, which may not be the complete picture. So it could be that much misleading. So I'll pause here and say, probably I'll be happy to further deep dive into what goes, into the impact factor, citation, and how researchers need to be made aware of that. And also being a society publisher, we'll be happy to educate people about that. So we are using all these things in a very sensible fashion. Thank you.
Perfect. And that's the kind of point of view that we needed at this point in this panel, I guess, because it was like going around the table and really the other side of the table that, okay, it's not only about the research community, but it's also about having stakeholdership of this publishing community. Having those commercially minded things and plagiarism and other things we can of course bring into the conversation later. And by the way, the joke about 400 citations should be on top of the nerdy jokes of scholarly communication, I think. So, moving on to our last panelist, Dr. Shekhar Sharma. Again, no-brainer question, but I think for our panel, it is an important thing to understand. What do you think are the issues of current frameworks of evaluation in terms of performance indices?
Thanks, Chagun, to put this question. And it was really nice to listen to the views from other panelists on this topic. And I think I agree with what Professor Ramgopal Rao mentioned, that these all parameters, indices, I think this is more because the academies, administrators, funding agency, they find it easy way to simplify their task of evaluation. To me, I will look into much broader aspect of this topic. The reason is, of course, we are talking about the individual researchers' performance evaluation, which is, of course, related to the journal, because that is one of the major parameters for the individual researcher is the journal citations impact factor. But if we see, to me, scientific performance evaluation is basically related to the researcher at an individual level. That brings to the scientific journal comparison. And then next is the university or the research organization itself, because now we see all kinds of rankings among the universities, national level as well as international level. So there is a performance evaluation of a university or the research organization. And then the last stage to me is the country-wise evaluation of the scientific performance. So if we see the researcher as an individual, as a young scientist, I represent here. So we are evaluated for various steps in our career at the hiring stage, for a postdoc to the academic position, promotion stage to the higher grade or permanent position, or the application for the grant or for the scientific prizes. And in this pursuit for the excellence, the research value of the scientist becomes the key ingredient which we are discussing. And if you see the present model, this research value, so-called research value, is assessed by, as we all have discussed, number of publications, quality of the papers in which we are publishing, impact of those publications, which is measured by, let's say, number of citations, and which is coming in the different formats like H-index and all. And that brings to the journals evaluation. And further, if we go to the universities, because universities also entered into this game of competition, comparison, since the introduction of Shanghai rankings. And now if you see, a lot of competing international rankings have flourished, and most of them focusing on the research performance with a heavy bias towards the natural sciences, medicine, but not at the humanities and social sciences. And finally, if you combine all these, then it brings to a fourth level of performance evaluation, which again impacts all these three as well. So these comparative analysis of scientific performance of the countries based on these some of the aggregate performance indicators of their scientific institutes, and this decides the government scientific policies and to reshape the scientific institutions landscape. So to me, the availability of these indicators is, I think, oversimplification of the quality assessment at various levels. And in my opinion, I think it needs a serious discussion and more inclusion as we see along further into this discussion. And I really look forward to hear from other senior panelists who are in the role of science administration or science academies representation or the funding agency representation. Thank you
so much, Dr. Sharma. I think the first segment has come to an end with, let's say, a foundational understanding and highlighting the issues. Probably we can spend the next segment thinking about what is the way forward solution. I'll begin with Professor Ramgopal. Professor, I think the concept of peer review, individuals, experts in the field, be it at the same level or a senior in one particular field, as you said, if you are from electron devices, you are in a better position to take a call immediately. Taking clue from that statement, how does peer evaluation, be it bias, quantitative, qualitative tools used by those peers, how does peer evaluation complement the current frame of evaluation? Like, are we doing it right in the Indian setup, at least when it comes to technical higher education?
There is it's very difficult to say right or wrong. I always look at these awards as, those who have got these awards, for example, Bhatnagar Award or any of these, they are good people. There is nothing wrong with them. But there are so many others who have not got it but are equally good. because when you are screening people across the disciplines, you start with some 40 people in one area, you finally bring it down to 4 or 5 people. Now those 4 or 5 are working in, 3 or 4 different departments. So there I would consider it's a lottery. I mean, beyond that, I don't even give too much of weightage to anything. If you have gone up to from 40 to 5, you have already been pretty good. I mean, we need to just increase the number of awards and not be so restrictive, and then unnecessarily complicate things for ourselves and everybody, because beyond that point, for all engineering, if you're deciding on one award, I know I am always very uncomfortable when I sit on those committees. So that is always a kind of an issue that I see. But I think I would always, I think you need a lot of maturity to serve on these committees. And I think the younger people sometimes tend to be looking at these objective criteria much more, take this objective criteria much more seriously than older people. So therefore, I would like to see people with some amount of maturity to be sitting on these committees. There are things which are mind-boggling. Some of the academies are actually asking, how many of, what is the total citation count of your first author papers. So now you need to go back to which papers you wrote in your career as a first author and find out how many citations you have received, and if that number is low, then it's not good for you, kind of a thing. Meaning, and then I also see now in our institutions, it's across all the institutions, the faculty members wanting to become first authors, not allowing PhD students to become the first authors, which I thought is a sacrilege. I mean, I just cannot believe that it is a total academic dishonesty for a faculty member to put himself or herself as the first author and not allow the PhD student to become the first author. I mean, our job, I thought, is to build careers. We have already got a job, we are doing well. Now our major important thing in our careers is to build more careers, and they're fighting with the students to become the first author. That irritates me to no end. But you can see where those people are coming from, because they are all looking at these metrics and seeing that how many papers have I written as first author or even as a single author now, which is also very important. I think these are all, we are taking things to the extreme now in terms of using these parameters to judge people. I think we need to be much more conscious of the deficiencies of this sort of a system. It has to be a combination of objective plus subjective. It cannot be one single thing. What happens very often is, if you apply only subjective criteria, somebody will come up and say, look, my H index is much higher than that person, why did you select that person? And if you go only by the objective criteria, somebody will say, I have written, for my work has been so impactful, this industry has used, that industry has used, I have licensed all these technologies, how can you not give me that award, kind of thing. There is no easy way to judge that. So it has to be a good combination of subjective and objective, and the committees also need to be broader. It cannot be one single, a committee consisting of only people with one kind of an orientation to be deciding these awards and all that. You need people from industries. You need people covering all the disciplines, where based on the candidates that you are judging. And then, I think we need to spend a lot of time. If we don't do that, and if I just look at H index and start giving awards, I'm doing an injustice to myself. And I think the onus lies eventually on the people who are on the other side of the table. And I think it's a pretty complicated kind of a thing, but you need to spend a lot of time on these kind of jobs.
Very clear point, Professor. Thank you so much. I think this is reflected as the voice of many decision makers at institutional level. Thank you so much for making that statement. Next, I'd like to pose this longish question to both Professor Hasan and Professor Sandeep Verma. The spectrum of science, or spectrum of research as we call, starting from basic curiosity-driven science, applied, experimental, up to translational and, let's say, directly societal impactful research. How do we look into the current performance evaluation? So many times what we end up doing is, when we talk of performance evaluation, we talk of only the productivity evaluation at the end of the research, what comes out of the research. But at the entire cycle of research, starting from taking people into the enterprise of research till the process and what comes out of it. If we see the spectrum and the current framework of evaluations that we have, this kind of dividend, basic science to applied, experimental, and all of it, how do you see this needs to have some customization? The evaluation needs to have its own customization. Maybe I'll begin with Professor Hasan and then I'll move to Professor Verma.
Sure. No, I think this is a very, very important question. So in fact, I was just thinking about it as, other speakers were talking. So one of the things I would say is that one really has to think differently when one is evaluating early researchers. So, new faculty who have joined in the last, say, 3 years or 4 years, and middle level and more senior people. One has to look at different parameters for judging how well they have done. In the case of younger people who have just joined, I think one of the most important parameters, you really can't ask them to give you, what is the societal impact of their research, right? They are just starting off. They can think about it, but that's not what you're going to be judging them on, right? So you need to actually think about whether this question that they are asking, is this really a question that is going to be of relevance? And for this, one has to have, people who are in the field and who are, senior and who can, actually make some judgment on this. So we need committees that are able to look at that, because you want to be able to ask, you want to check whether this younger person is asking a question that will in the long term actually answer something new and something different. You would like to reward people who are ahead of the curve, not people who are just following what is happening elsewhere in the world and are just wanting to repeat that. Those people also have value, but they are not necessarily the people who will bring about change. And you want to try and, but finding those kind of people, you really need thought, and you need to spend time looking at what is, what they are planning, what they are proposing. And you need experts, really, you do need experts. And what I think I said earlier also is that we have those kind of experts within the country. Of course, we can get inputs from outside also. So that is what I would say for the early level. The middle level, I think you have to start thinking about whether this person how well have the people who have come out of this lab done. I think that's very important, because, one of the main purposes of working in institutes and university is that you are mentoring younger people. And so you would like to know from a middle level person, how well are the people who are coming out from their lab, how well are they doing? Are they, moving on into positions that are also academic or even in, industry, wherever it is. But that is an important aspect that also needs to be brought into looking at them. And of course, in senior people, I think one would want to be trying to understand what is the societal impact of their work. And societal impact, of course, is a very broad area. And again, I think I can talk about that more broadly at some other time. But that is how I would think about it, at least, that you take different ways, different aspects, and look at younger people, middle level, and senior people. You can't, put the same parameters across everybody.
Thank you. I think it's a good question, and I think Professor Hasan pointed it out quite well. Segmenting 3 different, sections, if I were to say, the early career researchers, the middle level, as well as senior. So I give you a personal anecdote, when I started 25 years back, and when you come back, you want to start a career along with a couple of PhD students. How do you motivate yourself? How do you motivate your own students who are, looking up, and while you have a fear in your heart that what am I going to do here? Am I going to be successful? How am I going to be judged down the road, right? So what the idea I shared with my first 2 set of students was that let us do something when we, at the end of the day, say after 3 to 4 years or 5 years, by the time you have done your PhD and contributed to the growth of the group, would there be a person sitting somewhere far from Kanpur? I come from IIT Kanpur. Would they, if they are talking about that area, that discipline, sub-discipline, even a narrow topic, would our name come up in their discussion, right? Even if they are trying to organize a simple conference, would the name of our group come up, hey, we should invite them for a poster. Forget about a full lecture. I mean, we are not looking at that. So I try to instill that kind of, motivation. I would like youngsters to have that kind of motivation. Say, it doesn't matter. See, at the early phase, as Professor Hasan rightly points out, that you cannot be so straitjacketed. You are toying with various ideas. You do not know what is going to be successful, right? But that motivation would be good enough for a young group that at the end of the day, after 2, 3 years, 4 years, would there be a conversation about your research in some far off corner of the country? And better yet, in the world, that, oh, something very special is coming out of that group. That, I think, was really a good flagpole or sort of beacon for us that we followed all along, right? So, and I think that would be helpful as we move to the next level, when we were in the middle zone, right? When you are trying to grapple with promotions, and as Professor Rao correctly pointed out, these goalposts, one fellowship after the other, and I agree, it's a rat race. Some people get successful, some are not. We all are equal at the end of the day, but at that point of time, what ideas are going to be successful. So the performance indices in your mind, in your group's mind, are already set. It could be good journal, it could be good science, it could be just good productivity, even producing good students. That has to be that has to be a performance index. If your own students have dotted the landscape of this country to begin with, where they are disseminating knowledge, they are disseminating good science. Now, when you come to senior level or elder or older professors, like say I or Professor Rao, then we have to be, role models in everything. I mean, I'm talking about honesty, I'm talking about integrity in science, creating good ideas, mentoring people, just generally be around so that people can feel that how science should work. And, we bounce off our ideas without being too, top down imposing on people. So performance, again, I mean, we are moving away from bibliometrics. As Deeksha also pointed out, they were meant for something else. But right now, at these levels, whenever you are at certain level of maturity, assistant, associate, or some scientist level, I think our roles would demand that our performance be measured by many, many different parameters rather than quantitative. And we still could be doing excellent science and, just be a good role model for younger people to grow up with. I hope I have made some sense, Chagun. Yeah, please go ahead.
Certainly. I think it just keeps adding to the what do you call the spectrum that we're trying to unfold. I think that these thoughts will eventually lead to a little more thinking on evaluation itself as a practice, I believe. Moving on to Dr. Deeksha, I mean, maybe not a direct question, it's an indirect question. Probably I expect the answer might have something relevant to add to this panel. Do you think as a scientific society broadly, not just in India, globally, we would need another Eugene Garfield to take birth and define what we call as progress of knowledge?
Thank you, Dr. Basha. And before I share my thoughts onto that, I cannot stop emphasizing and echoing what Professor Verma said. I think mentoring and scientific outreach are two most underrated, unacknowledged, and thankless things which an academician or researcher would want to do. Whereas these two things are really about not just me-centric, but really thinking about broader ecosystem, because creating good PhD students, building generations, and really thinking about that good quality cultural continuity is also a responsibility of a scientist. And that definitely should be the part of qualitative parameter that we are continuously talking about beyond the quantitative thing, right? And quantitative things were, made as like the measures, but now they have become the target. And the moment any measure become the target, it already, ceases to serve purpose. So definitely now is the time where we have to really rethink and reconfigure, especially what are the needs of this country. Because in general, if you see, we are pretty much into a very different growth trajectory and the mindset, and everything is different, especially in this narrative of COVID-19. What this country has seen, what we can do as a nation is very, very different thing. So adding to what you are saying, See, rebooting, refreshing any system which has been in practice for decades is very difficult. We can definitely hypothetically think and plan and probably start from somewhere, but small things and especially cultural changes are the fundamental for anything. And how do culture change? Culture actually changed like with one person, right? A very popular established person, and even two people on this panel. So for example, 3, 4, Professor Hasan, Dr. Sharma, Professor Rao, Professor Verma, what type of culture they are, have in their group, actually it is impacting to a lot of people already, right? Whether it is in terms of the science outreach or, the ethics, integrity, because this is what those people are carrying. When it comes to the publishing space, because these impact factor, citation, all those metrics are so deep rooted into the mind, now people have really stopped recognizing the importance of classic journals. And this is so painful. I'll give you example here by some numbers, maybe deviating a little bit, Dr. Basha, by the question, but I really want to share that. One of our most distinguished journal, JACS, Journal of the American Chemical Society, it published closely 2,300 articles in a year. And its impact factor organically grew over some hundreds of years to 15, right? Because there was never this narrative of having JACS like, a 50 impact factor journal or a 100 impact factor journal, which could have been done if that was the intention. Now there are journals who come into the market in like 5 year, 10 year, and then they say, our impact factor are higher than, XYZ. And if you do that simple maths, some of so-called journals which say, they are better than some journal publish 200 articles in a year, right? And they have impact factor of like 20, 23, 25. If you really do the citation distribution, only 5% or 10% of the articles out of 200 or whatever that number is contributing to that impact factor, which is really high. Rest other articles are just a dead tail. And if you take the 10% of the articles into the JACS, they will contribute impact factor of 50 plus 60, 70, because they are just like, the breakthrough science and, the leader into the field. And that applies to any basic journal. It could be by ACS or by any other publisher for that matter. So my point of view here is, researchers really need to be mindful of the community they are choosing to publish in. What is the reputation? What is, the scientific merit? Who are the people making decision? Who are the peers publishing over there? And all these narratives definitely can be established from the top at some point. Because if you are acknowledging that, recognizing that, incentivizing that, then people would be thinking, oh, that's the right way to do things, versus say, hey, you have total impact factor of this. And you'll be laughing, I receive even CVs at PhD level where people say, I have total impact factor of this, combining, the sum of the all impact factor of the journal they have published. I was like, really, how does that matter? Plus, citation habits are very different. So this is, really like two culture. How people cite in materials are very different than organic, than electrical engineering, than mechanical engineering, than maths, than agriculture, right? So we cannot really have the orange to apple comparison and then reaching to some point where we say, this is a good journal. There are some biology journal have 150 impact factor, right? And there are some top-notch mathematics or electrical engineering journal have, even less than 1 impact factor sometimes. So do you see that's a good journal or that's a bad journal? So we really have to think about like, this self-citation narrative, which also lead to negative citation, because what should be cited is actually not cited, and what should not be cited have been overly cited. And I already told you a story about, this phantom citation. So we have to be a little bit more mindful, more educated, and that's why I'm re-emphasizing. Academies can play an important role in educating, especially early career researchers, about what goes into metrics. So they can really make a very mindful call where they should be choosing to publish or how they should write their profile. And often the time I see, oh, my, H index is this, or, my total number of citation goes into that. So those are, the trendy things we are establishing, probably not very healthy in long run. So I will pause here, Dr. Sharma.
The message is very clear. Understand the ingredients and the composition of what goes into those metrics. I think that part is pretty strongly made. We will come back to the point of opening what you actually started as a question to all the panelists. I really like to go a little deeper into that. Before, I think we have Dr. Chandrasekhar Sharma, and when I asked this question to Dr. Sharma, I think he's the voice of so many other researchers sitting and watching this panel about ageism as one of the factors in our evaluation. for some reason, in extramural funding, competitive funding opportunities, there is a certain ageism followed in various levels, starting from PhD fellowships to postdoctoral fellowships, and the miracle age of 35 pops up everywhere, and we have been seeing that criticism at many places. I'm really thankful that the panel has ample time to go through those questions. Dr. Sharma, how do you think this kind of ageism-related criteria are seen broadly by early career researchers and young faculty members, as well as what do you propose to science administrators and policymakers sitting on this panel about those kind of criteria?
Well, I think, thanks for your question. So, I mean, as I think Professor Hasan has mentioned that, the criteria for the evaluation has to be different for different age of researchers. So obviously that brings that there has to be some factor or some evaluation, some prizes or some funding based on that age criteria. So I do not see really any problem with that. Of course, one can debate on whether the young scientists or some extramural funding or some prizes, they should be limited to the 35 years or 40 years. In fact, INSA Young Scientist Medal, which used to be up to 35 years, like any other young scientist awards, I think INSA has discussed the issue and they have revised the age to now 40 this year. So that can be debated whether it is 35 or 40, especially when you go for postdoc for at least 3 to 4 years after PhD. And when you come back, so by the time you are 32, 33, 34, and then you are basically evaluated as an independent researcher. But I think by that time you do not have any real parameter for the independent research, because so far you have done the research either in the postdoc or even the PhD with a group. So one can really discuss that aspect of having a young scientist or independent research awards or funding. But I think, yes, somewhere you have to draw a line. So whether it is 35 or 38 or 40, that's something which can be discussed further. Because the issues also for different ages of the researchers are different. When they start their career, when they come back after a postdoc from abroad. So, so for example, I'm just telling that for, let's say if you are coming from outside India after a postdoc, working in a large group, you might be having more number of citations, more number of papers as compared to when you do your research completely in India. So I think, again, we have to normalize those things. And again, if you take the issues further to the mid-career, where people start really making an independent mark, then of course, the evaluation has to be different, as I think Professor Hasan also rightly mentioned. So somewhere I think this ageism has to be there because the issues are different and they need to be addressed differently.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Before I move on to an open question for all the panelists, I would like to have reflection from Professor Sandeep Verma on the same thought as well, because there are some 8 questions exactly on the same. I would like to have your thoughts answered.
Can you rephrase your question?
Yeah, so there are these criteria. There are various criteria when it comes to evaluating people, be it selection, fellowship, awards, scholarship. Then there is the age factor there. And is age really matter? Or should it have to be a PhD plus 3 years of experience, or should it have to be like 35 years, like a biological age? Does it really matter?
I think age should not be that big a factor to begin with, because what I felt always is that, we all start their education differently. And when we are in a PhD program, depending on the complexity of the problem or how fortunate we are to wind up a given research problem, or sometimes it takes a little longer, these precious years and months add up right? Not just at the doctoral level, but also at the postdoctoral level. And if you were to do a couple of postdocs, you don't know how much you have to go through, what kind of months and years add up. So I am very happy to hear that INSA has increased the young scientist medal age to 40. And we have been doing at SERB the same thing. We have moved our certain age of certain fellowships. We have made so broad from 35 to 55, right? So I think Professor Ramgopal Rao, Professor Hasan, they all have been, emphasizing on the fact that, not everybody would bloom at the same time. There are late bloomers. There are early career people who require certain specific set of equipment or facility that may take couple of years or few years to put it all together. So if we were to make that artificial boundary of a certain age, right, on top of it, when you are when you are getting promotions, right? So in certain IIT, I mean, in most IITs, you carry your own position, means as many people can become associate, as many people can become professor, which may or may not be true for a university, right? But if you look at from a different angle, when you are trying to make these barriers in fellowships, in awards, rewards, on top of it, if you reduce it to number two, right? As Professor Ramgopal was pointing out, that Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize in Engineering Sciences to be given to only 2 people across disciplines, sub-disciplines. So it is a problem. It is a problem that we have been acknowledging even as academicians. Forget about being on a chair or not, right? But the change has to happen, and we all are waiting. It's not that we are not contributing to solutions. We are trying to raise the problem as this panel is doing, but at the end of the day, we have to take it to the people who would actually make it happen. When you talk about universities, just very briefly, the last point, if you take it to IITs, for example, many times, they may not consider someone at 37 years of age to begin as an assistant professor. And the department, the institution head, they may have certain, objections or some notions, not objections, notions, which may not play in favor of certain individuals. But more often than not, I think the time has come to accommodate as many people as possible, given the kind of numbers we are looking at a very qualified, highly qualified individuals. So a change has to happen, and no better than, sooner it is, the better is for all of us. Thanks, Shekhar.
Oh, perfect, perfect, Professor Verma. Thank you so much for reflecting on that thought, because I'm sure this topic itself needs a separate panel discussion for 2 hours, because there are a lot of comments when you are making the statement that the change has to happen and the spectrum has been increased in the CRB itself. And there are a lot of reflections from the researchers of INYAS itself. So we will, of course, collect all those thoughts and put it together. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just make one small point in this ageism question? It does work very strongly against women researchers, this ageism. And I just wanted to bring that point up, because, you're saying it's a biological age, but the fact is that biology is running at a certain pace, and, women take time off to have children. And so it's often that they are at a disadvantage in this. So I just wanted to bring up that point, because somehow it got left out. Yeah. I agree completely with what everybody else said, though. Yeah.
That's exactly what we wanted to hear. Yeah. Yes, please.
Just echoing a little bit over there, I think there have been so many panels and committees talking about diversity, why women drop out, and things like that. I think this is exactly about having the yardstick and having the tools. So these metric, that metric, these indices, we have all these options, but which one we are going to pick, for a particular situation, I think choice remains still on the decision maker. And that's where we need to be a little cautious and careful. What needs to be adopted when to decide what? I think this is where the human intelligence parts come.
No, certainly so. I think that's exactly what Professor Verma was also coming to. I think the change has to happen, and there is no better time to happen than what we are doing right now. With that message, I think I'll just pose the larger question that we have for all of us to reflect on, and then we'll move on to take questions from the audience and the participants. The larger question is this. Let me take a minute to reflect it as clearly as possible. As we see from the last, let's say, 50 minutes when we started talking about performance evaluation of science in general, more or less we spend 90% of time on bibliometrics, bibliometric indicators, aspects of bibliometrics. So the larger concept of scientometrics, which goes much beyond bibliometrics, as Professor Hasan rightly pointed out. We started with a set of indicators multiple decades back because that were the only thing available at our disposal, bibliometric indicators, channel-based track factors. Even in this conversation, we kept coming back to those bibliometric indicators. If we are given a chance to formulate set of indicators, given that we have new set of monitoring tools now, like NIRF collects a lot of data, ARIA from Ministry of Education, the Other Innovation Ranking collects a lot of data apart from bibliometric data. Similarly, the All India Survey of Higher Education Institutions as well. So when we have such tools available at our disposal, how can we build or what all we can consider beyond bibliometrics when we want to move towards, let's say, meaningful evaluation? May I begin with Professor Ramgopal?
Yeah, so these things also, vary. At least I have been sitting on so many committees. So when I look at, evaluating anyone, I look at three aspects. One is education. The second is research. The third is innovation. And I tell people that the education is something that everybody has to do. I mean, if you are going to become a faculty member, writing papers, becoming a researcher and all that, I think, how well you mentor your students and how much of an impact you had on their lives is also very important. In fact, I have always asked this question when somebody says, I have guided 10 PhD students. My next question is, where are they working right now? What has happened to these PhD students? That has always been my standard question, because it's not number of students that you have graduated, what is the quality of these students, where have been able to get a job, and that's always very important. And even when I see a young faculty candidate, I see 10 papers in 10 different journals, I get worried. To me now today, if you have a paper, you can find a journal to publish. There are enough journals now for every paper. So now if you have 10 papers in 10 journals, it worries me a little bit. I mean, it only means that you have always been finding a journal where the paper can come through. That consistency also I would like to see. And because at that entry level, that's all what we can look at. The citations and all of that will come much later. And then if you are again the patents, the innovation part of it, if somebody has filed 10 patents, and then wants to file the 11th patent, I've always asked this question: how many more patents would you like to file, before you start a company, before something happens to all these patents? If you are just building a CV for the sake of building a CV, then that to me doesn't impress much. If you have filed 10 patents and if you have done some technology transfers or started a company, I have no issue with you filing some more patents. So that is how I judge people. And I think, overall, that's what we all need to be doing. We should not be looking at just the numbers. In everything, you need to look at what next kind of a thing. And I think that's how things have been. And overall, I think at least wherever I sit on the committees, I look at this phenomenon.
Perfect. You have clearly given a few new things to consider if you are developing new evaluation frameworks. I just want to add one more angle to it before I ask maybe Professor Hasan to reflect on the same question. Okay, what are we measuring, right? When it comes out of, let's say, a black box called research and development and doing science, is it knowledge creation is an output that we are measuring, or the impact of the knowledge to the society and economic development and well-being of the society is what we are measuring? If we keep these thoughts also into consideration, what would be our new evaluation framework beyond bibliometrics?
Yeah, very, very important, I think. So, like I said, for an early researcher, what is important is to try and understand what is the question this person is asking and how much is it going to actually bring new knowledge, So as Professor Sandeep Verma mentioned earlier, that, when you do your first few experiments, when you publish your first few papers, is somebody outside actually going to then look at this and say that, wow, this work is coming from this lab, So that is in the early stages, of course. as you grow and you move forward, it turns out that not everything, so the work brings out certain questions, further questions, which you may not be able to answer in your own lab. And I would consider people who are then able to actually step out of their own lab, work with other groups, build collaborations, especially at the middle level, as definitely people who should be, rewarded in different ways. Not everybody is able to do that. And I'm not saying that everybody has to do that either. But I do think that people who are able to do that, their work is definitely more impactful in time. It is able to actually get, because you are able to then answer the question from multiple different ways, right? You are answering it from your lab, but there are other ways that it can be asked. And if that can be done, then you are answering it in many ways. And you are essentially firming up the data that you are bringing out, because it's being developed from multiple aspects, And so it becomes more believable, which is what you want, right? You want a solid body of work, which you would then take forward into whatever else, if you want to take it to a patent, or you want to take it to, some kind of a implement or whatever it is. But it needs to be something that is absolutely firm. So I would definitely say that collaborative ability to collaborate and to take your work outside your own lab and work with other people is an important aspect, which I think we tend to overlook a little bit. I think there is a tendency now to start, appreciating this, but this is important. Finally, I think one of the most important things is institution building as well. So along with being able to mentor your own students and doing well, you also need to contribute, if you're working in an institution, to the improvement of that institution in many ways. And that is also, and that I think again comes to senior people, right? I mean, there should be some way by which one can look at and say that, these people have contributed to the betterment of this institution in various ways, have helped to, put together the culture in this institute so that things get better and, younger people find it easier to work here. So I would say that these are some of the things that I think we are not considering it sufficiently right now. And we need to start considering in terms of, parameters for judging people.
Certainly. I think we're very clear 2 points. I think before I ask Professor Sandeep Verma, I would like to also pose this question. This is a personal curiosity question. In SERB's evaluation panel, does the administrative duties and their performances also taken into consideration when you award someone or give them grants, Professor Verma?
We do not consider any administrative responsibility that PI would render at their institution as part of the judgment on a given new idea or a proposal. No, it's not used.
Continuing to that, would it be, listening from Professor Hasan, would it be a criteria to consider when we try to have them do some large-scale projects as a quality that as a PI they have earned?
I think it goes without saying that, I mean, I have always been aware of the fact that when we do research, small, big, large, or consortium, whatever, there has to be an accountability, right? At the moment, if we are not going to use these parameters for promotion, award, reward, if we want to get away from it, still the money given for in any shape or form, right? It has to have an accountability, and at the moment, certain parameters are being used, and they could be refined a bit further. But what I would like to do towards the end of this session is play devil's advocate, and because a lot of young people are listening to this conversation, and they are posing questions. I'm glancing on the chat box, etc. But what I would like to also point out is that when we do research, when we start a laboratory in an institution, right? So we get an institution, we apply to very many places. I go to IIT Kanpur, IIT Delhi, wherever, right? So now when we start writing a research proposal, it is all our brain, all our sweat and blood, right? Nobody is telling us to work in a given area, or it's not top down, right? So I would also like to know at some point of time, so that people can also reflect. We are not in question answer session with them, that have they put enough effort in building up their career by choosing problems that are outstanding. In choosing problems, of course, we can always talk about research infrastructure. NCBS would have certain research infrastructure, IIT Kanpur, and IIT Rourkela. If we set aside that, if we know what is available to us, still within that with that background, have we done the best possible job in coming up with ideas, coming up with problems that reflect the true grit, sharp intellect, something which is magical? Because at this moment, when we are looking ahead 5 years from now, we are aspiring to be a bigger country, bigger R&D footprint. Our GERD is increasing. Many new programs are shaping up in terms of national mission. How are we going to contribute? Small problems, a very myopic view of looking at research, that I should get 10 publications, as Professor Rao pointed out, in 10 different journals, so that I become associate professor. So I think we have, some of us, when you look at people who have been successful, like Professor Rao, for example, I mean, he's a great nanotechnology person. They have taken chances. None of the careers who are big people now, Professor Hasan, Professor Sharma aspiring, they have taken chances in the early part of their career, and the path has never been easy, never been rosy, or without any, impediment. But we have to put our act together. All youngsters, we cannot be hiding behind, many impediments we all have faced. Just last personal point. I mean, I have taken an NMR sample, mass sample from IIT Kanpur, sat in roadways bus to Lucknow to get the analysis done, right? Now we have mass spec, now we have other equipment, but none of our careers were so easy that, everything worked out for most of us. No. So I think while we are discussing performance, lot has gone in building some careers that people look at, they are iconic, and we should study them. We should look at how they have overcome the challenges at that point of time, and whether some of these notions could be, or some lessons could be applied here. I may not have given your answer, but I really wanted to put it across for many, many younger colleagues who are listening to this panel.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you for doing that. I mean, you captured many thoughts that are reflected in the comment box. So thanks for doing that. Coming back to that question, I think you answered the question in addition to what Professor Hasan was adding to. I think she has given clear indications of two parameters that needs to be looked into very carefully, as well as what you just said in SERB practices and beyond SERB as well. Adding to that question again, before I ask Professor Shekhar Sharma and Dr. Deeksha, how about thinking of altmetrics? Now, social media is being used to communicate science in many platforms. And during pandemic, we have seen how social media has been used for all kind of purposes when it comes to scientific information and hardcore scientific publication, outputs, and data transfer and everything. Altmetrics is a own research field in addition to scientometrics. Now it has come under the scientometrics umbrella. How would you see altmetrics being used as a mainstream tool for performance evaluation of individual researchers? We'll begin with Dr. Deeksha and then go to
Thank you, Dr. Basha. That's very interesting topic. And, there are always cycles, right? Once one concept comes, then people like it, then there are some issues, then another concept comes to address it, then it itself has another problem, then another thing happens. So this is like a cycle. So coming to the alt metric, right? This is another metric which came as a counter to solve the problems or issue what these bibliometric had, and more short-term evaluation impact of everything. But we also need to see a little bit more into, as I mentioned earlier, how it happens, right? What goes into that number, which comes as like a beautiful colored donut over there, and a lot of parameter which we need to understand there. So it's like how the information pile in, news stories, tweets, social media, Facebook like, anything which is into the online space. Now comes to, there are certain institutes who have a very good PR, like, tactic, so immediately there are a few labs, if they did, something cool, immediately you will have like a journalist. And then those people pick basically research, either it's trendy, catchy, provocative, or, sometimes making like an exciting news story. So everything which is having a very high alt metric does not mean, it's like a really cool science and a breakthrough science or anything. This is again, jurisdiction, or I would say judgment of like people, How do we really make sense? So it's not very high altmetric score, right? 25 newspaper covered it, because so many times it's just like a copy paste, right? And even they don't just change a lot of the things and then, keep doing the same iteration over and over. I'm personally not like a dead fan, but still, I think this is a great way to increase the visibility, readability, and especially useful thing for Gen Z and Digi generation. We cannot forget, the millennials and the generation we have. They are actually all very tech savvy. And these things actually excite them and, have some content feeding into the social media. But again, there need to be, again, some filters and provide some education about don't literally take what is there on altmetric. Also understand what feeds into that. And not every high profile is like, really actually a good sign. So I will pause here.
No, perfect. I mean, the answer is as provocative as the question, I would understand. I was just reading through while you were saying the news from ISC this morning. ISC's novel Lab lets the monkey play and work as the scientists study. This is the most read article in Indian science today, because there is a monkey and there is a monkey playing inside ISC's lab. So
exactly, right? Isn't it like interesting, cool, and something more sort of like a spicy thing you would want to read and avoiding boredom? So it's a lot more like the interesting, catchy thing which goes into like high onto altmetric.
Exactly.
And relating more with masses.
Yeah, without passing on whether this should be or should not be, let me listen to Professor Shekhar Sharma, and then we'll go into some of the other questions from Q&A.
Yeah, I think it's a interesting matrix, and of course I agree with Dr. Deeksha that there are a lot more apprehensions about it. Of course, even the current parameters like H index and all that, they're also not perfect. But certainly altmetrics, I would say there are two distinct advantages of it. One, it relates or it basically complements the scientific social responsibility, because when you communicate your science to the common public through various social media pages, to which not many scientific people are really interested. So I think that gives an edge to have the open science. And especially when you go for the journal-based metrics, and again, that's a separate topic of discussion, that many of the journals, they are either the press subscription-based, they are not, or open access. So you really have a limitation when you really want to cite a good paper, and your institute may not have the access to that paper, and you may not be able to cite that, right? So of course, those kind of parameters, journal-based metrics, they have serious flaws. So I think it's a good change, and to bring the altmetrics also into the discussion. And of course, I mean, there is no normalization, there is time dependency factor also into it. But these are, I mean, at least if we start with, we can really look into the betterment of those metrics.
Thank you so much. I mean, considering the flood of questions here, I think we might not be able to cover all of them. I'm just going to cherry pick few which just catches the attention here, which not answered before. I'll open up the Q&A questions for the panelists now. The first one, again, a pretty strong question, repeated twice. The senior colleagues are mostly evaluating the junior colleagues in most of the setup in decision making and everything. Why a mentee is not given a chance to evaluate a mentor, be it a PhD program or in a larger lab where there is a peer? Are there any panelists who would like to reflect on that thought?
Yeah, I can answer some of that. I think it's a good idea. I actually think that one should have the mentees. And I actually, in our institute in NCBS, we are now trying to do this to some extent. Obviously, it cannot be done, openly, because I think there's always this worry that, if that the mentor might, it's a delicate relationship, right? A PhD student and a mentor's relationship. But even anonymously, I think it's not a bad idea for people to give their inputs. And I don't see anything wrong in actually obtaining that. What is done with it has to be done more carefully, because obviously, somebody's work may be going very badly and they might be feeling very bad about it. And they, for various reasons, these things happen. And just blaming the mentor for it, that mentor might well be at fault, but there might be other reasons too. So it cannot just be taken as a single sort of, input. It has to be looked at more holistically. And, but receiving the inputs, I think per se is not a bad thing. I think that is a good idea. And I think it should be encouraged wherever it's possible.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Hasan. Any other thoughts on that? Yes.
Very standard practice in corporates, right? So which is called as 360 feedback, and everyone gives feedback to everyone. And even before every lecture or seminar, there is something called as suggestion X, where people can anonymously write their question. And so the point here is there need to be a safety wall or a safety net. So the person who is asking question is also not afraid of consequences if the person did not like. At the same time, the people on whom the feedback is given should not be posted publicly, because the purpose for that is improve the system. So these things need to be done in a more private one-to-one fashion, or more close-knit setup. So the purpose remain actually the productive, not really create more negativity and more complication around.
Perfect. Professor Verma, you had any?
Yeah, I wanted to add that, of course, maybe not in the same way that the question has been posed, but if you look at some of us, when we teach a course in our institutions, at the end of the course, all students are giving feedback. They are filling bubbles. They have sufficient space to write whatever they want to write, right? I mean, bouquets and brickbats, all are welcome. In fact, that's what Deeksha, Dr. Gupta is telling, that it's all anonymized, and these teaching feedback, if the course went on well, did it have the latest content, if the homework, if the quizzes delivered. So the whole bundle of anxiety that a student would face while taking a course is summarized at the end of the course, and with no penalties towards anybody, right? So it has been happening. It's just that when you talk about mentee and mentor, PhD and PhD student and PhD mentor, that relationship is more tenuous. I mean, you are one-on-one all the time. And I think if you still do not have the courage to go back to your sir and tell, or madam and tell, hey, I don't like this idea, I want to drop it, or I was not happy with the way I was treated, I think that then you are not Generation Z. You are still, you cannot be saying that we are moving ahead and still in your, you are so muted. You can go. And I think I would say, from my standpoint, 90% of the faculty at the moment, who are doing active research, they would welcome such a feedback. You directly go knock on the door and say, hey, I don't like this. And I think, or even a procedure, protocol, idea, journal where you want to publish, supervisor says publish there, student says, no, I would like to rather try here. It's all the same conflict, right? So you cannot package it in some shape or form, but I think we should get the courage and speak out.
Perfect. Yeah, that's good.
Just adding to that part, I think this is such close to my heart, especially. We call it something healthy conflict. And so PhD, or that problem-solving journey, which I call it for 5 years, is not just about solving a research problem. That is really a time when we groom ourselves as a professional and establish ourselves as an independent PI or a researcher or a professional, and personality development and building those assertive communication, learning to say things which people may or may not like, I think is part of the training as well. So this is more of a self-reflection on a mentee, I would say, more of a mentor, because this is our responsibility to build that communication space as well.
Yeah. Can I just say something?
Yes.
So I agree. I think mentees should be able to come and do that, but it also is the responsibility of the mentor to develop an atmosphere in the lab where mentees are comfortable doing this. And it's very important. I think this is very important for all people to understand that if there should be a complete ability for the mentee to not feel scared to come and talk to you. I agree that in the beginning people might feel a little scared, and I think in my personal experience, at least, I find that the early students, they tend to be a little more hesitant. They even call me ma'am, though in my lab everybody else calls me by my first name. So but they get out of it slowly. They get out of it, and by the time they are in that second, third year, things are much more at ease. And it takes a little time, but it is the responsibility of the mentor to some extent to build that atmosphere. And it's important.
Oh, perfect. And thanks, Zille, for this question. I think all of them have reflected, with all the positive point of view. Just to add, I think academic mental health also factors in this kind of relationship when it comes to mentor-mentee evaluation. Moving on to the next audience question. Bias and transparency in closed-door evaluation. The question reflects from, I think, probably the objective metrics and numeric metrics are more prominent today because of personal biases. And to minimize the personal biases of humans that are sitting around and evaluating, this is more prominent. Is there a thought conflict here? What about bias and transparency in our evaluation practice?
I think where humans are judging people, there will always be some biases. You cannot eliminate that. But that's also the reason why individuals don't make a decision. It's always a committee which makes a decision. There is a consensus that is evolved. But I think you cannot take away, unfortunately, these biases from the system. And I don't know how to do that. So,
Professor, if you could reflect on, can we make our evaluation practices a little more transparent? Also another aspect to that, because most of our evaluation is closed door, and for some reason it says that closed and binded. It's written on the documents itself. Is there a specific reason?
It is transparent. I don't just because it's not in public domain. The usual assumption is that it's all not done properly, kind of thing. But I think a lot of discussions go through, and in good committees, major awards, quite a lot of hours are spent in identifying the good people. But the only problem is there are so many good people, there are so few awards. At some point it all becomes a little bit unfair to those who are not getting it. I think that is one issue. So for that we need to have more awards. India as a country has grown in size. Now we have so many more researchers in every area. To give those just 2 awards for Bhatnagar awards every year to all the engineering disciplines, I think we need to scale up these awards. Swarna Jayanti, they have done that now. Now Swarna Jayanti, more awards are given. Earlier it used to be 8 or 9 awards. I used to say that at the age of 40 years, now if you start to discourage people who are doing very well by denying them, some of these awards, I think they live with that negativity for a long time to come, which is not helping the system. Swarna Jayanti, we must give 30 or 40 Swarna Jayanti fellows. Bhatnagars can be, 15, 20, and then you go to the higher levels, where it can narrow down. But we need to build a large base of good researchers. I think that identifying many people below 40 years of age across the country is very important through these processes. I think, I would like to see more awards given for early stage researchers.
Yes, Professor.
I am thankful to Professor Rao for raising the Swarna Jayanti part. So, sir, since it has come to SERB, you and a lot of young colleagues are listening. We have explicitly said, or I have explicitly said, there is no cap. If tomorrow engineering PAC or engineering side brings us 6 top-level contenders for Swarna Jayanti, we will fund all of them. And same is true with all disciplines. So at the moment, in written document, we do not have any cap on the number of Swarna Jayanti awards. So I think that has been really helpful. I think I also felt quite, quite uncomfortable looking at 8 or 9 under 40 people being, support. It's not even a recognition. It is unstructured support for a research that would make a difference 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So we cannot be so shortchanging them. So at the moment, there is no cap, sir. So I hope this message goes across.
Thank you so much, Professor Verma. I think that's a great announcement, also sensitization statement for the audience that are listening. Professor Hasan, you had.
I just wanted to elaborate, actually just try and bring together 2 points of view. So the number of awards, I agree, there should be more, and that's a very good thing. We were discussing ageism as well. And I think we need to think about Swarna Jayanti in the context of ageism as well, because I personally know very good young women researchers who are being left out of the Swarna Jayanti because of this ageism. It's probably happening to men too. I just don't know them, that's all. But so I think that's an aspect. It would be nice if, SERB could actually think about that as well. It's just an independent point. And, considering we talked about ageism, I just wanted to bring that up.
I just very quickly answer, because people are listening, that now we have certain awards at SERB which are going beyond 40, which give equal amount of or equal or slightly less amount of money for research. And for female researchers, I think some of us would know that SERB Power, from providing opportunities for women in exploratory research, we are giving research grants, as well as we are identifying Power Fellows, Power Fellowships, which is almost like Swarna Jayanti Fellowship, which personal money and research money, which is unstructured. So we are not binding it under, consumable travel. So you get a lump sum, you spend the way you want. So we hope that in, say, 5 years of time, we would have enough Power alumna rather, who would vouch for the flexibility that we have started offering at the moment. Thank you.
A lot of announcements. I think people are applauding for them. And thanks for bringing it up, Professor Hasan. We now have a finishing round of comments, and then I'll quickly summarize and hand it over to the chair, INYAS, for the concluding the session. So 30 seconds if we go around the table and say if we are building a responsible and healthy research and science evaluation practice, what is the one thing that you would expect it should be part of it? I'll begin with Dr. Deeksha, and then I'll go around with it.
Dr. Basha, can you please repeat your question? The last part I totally missed.
Yeah, the question is, if you are building a responsible and a healthier, better research evaluation practice and framework in the country, what is the one thing that you would expect as part of it?
Sure. So I'll say responsible metrics. So we really need to club that metrics with a sense human intelligence and that qualitative part, because in isolation, they would even double harm us.
Perfect. Professor Hasan?
So yeah. One thing I would like that in more committees, we have more people who are evaluating, particularly in the case of grants and things, that we have more younger researchers, some not sort of very early, but at least middle level researchers. There's a tendency for only very senior researchers to be there. And I think that needs to change to some extent. It has changed at one point, but it didn't. So that's one thing I would definitely like. And this is in terms of grants. In terms of evaluating for promotions and things like that, I think we need to really go beyond what I said earlier. We need to go beyond just these matrices that are there, the citation index. We need to look at the question asked. And as I said, we need to do it in different ways for different levels. And that is something we need to formalize a little bit, because if we keep it completely flexible, then people, fall to the lowest this thing and just say, okay, we'll just look at citation indices and H index and we won't look at anything else. So some formalization of this process is required as soon as possible in all of these committees.
Sounds perfect. Thanks so much, Professor. Professor Ramgopal Rao.
No, I also agree. I think that integrity of the committee is what really matters, the people who are on the committee. I think, I agree with it's already covered in areas.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Sandeep Verma.
I think we have had good discussion. We have covered most points, but just as a parting thing, our younger investigators have to be tenacious. I mean, there would be no point of time that, it would appear that there is disparity. There is, things are not being so evenly, keeled that one would like to be. But set it aside, I think we would be more tenacious. We have to be more tenacious, and good science has to happen one way or the other. Thank you.
I would like to, there is one very interesting question here, which is about collaborations. That, someone is asking, Meghna Krishna is asking, in some institutions, these international collaborations are looked down upon, and then denied promotions or awards for people who are collaborating. I think that's a important point. Sometimes when we look at for a very young researcher, when somebody joins as an assistant professor, what you look for when you want to promote that person is your ability to do independent research. From day one, if all your work is all through collaborations, some committees sometimes take it as a negative kind of thing. And have you done any work on your own, or are you dependent on others for everything that you do? So I think at early stage, you need to write lots of good papers, establish yourself as a good researcher. Then a stage will come when you want to collaborate and you want to be more impactful. I think, there are different times when you do different things. If you continue to only publish all your life, you are not doing a great thing. And so therefore, I think at different ages, you do different things. And I think that's how it should be. And there is nothing like it's good or bad. I mean, it again needs to be looked into in a very subjective kind of a way. But at some point, one would always look at, is this person capable of doing independent research? Researcher, I think that also becomes very important. But also, as a parting thing, I should tell you, I have served in good institutions. There are some very fine people. I mean, some great researchers, or rather great individuals. And these are the go-to people in a department when anyone has a research problem to address. If you are stuck in a research problem, you go to these people because they have such a, kind of breadth and depth to their understanding. And these are the kind of people. But they haven't written enough papers. They have never applied for any awards. They have never even sought any fellowships. But we all know that they are great people. So therefore, I think this whole concept that unless you get these awards, you are great, otherwise not, I think we need to move away from that. And I can name at least 5 or 6 people among my own contacts who I think are beyond all these awards. Any day they are better than people, I have got all the awards. Any day I can think they are better than me. And I think there are such people in our system who don't care about awards, which is okay. So I think we all need to keep that in mind. It's not always about getting awards as a recognition kind of it.
Perfect parting message. Thank you so much for saying that. Now I forgot who I have not asked. Yeah, Dr. Sharma is the last. Sorry, Dr. Sharma.
Yeah, I mean, if you ask me one thing, then I think, of course, we cannot really get away with these performance indicators. So better to go with a normalization with respect to the field, with respect to the time period, with respect to the size, as well as I think we should be more inclusive in our approach, where we can also take the consideration of scientific social responsibility. That's what I would say.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been a personal pleasure for me to have this conversation with all of you. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'd just like to quickly summarize some of the salient points that came out. I think starting from the conversation from the beginning itself, I think it's been advocated that the model of evaluation should be hybrid. It should not be fully objective based, and peer review has its own role to play. And there are important reasons to consider why it is very, very crucial to understand the limitations of these indicators and indices. And as Dr. Deeksha said, like the limitations of some of the existing journal-based indicators also need to be informed to all the early career researchers before they take them completely seriously. And that should be considered as just one part of the entire story, not the complete evaluation package itself. And suggestions such as more younger people in the committees and factors such as collaborations and leadership qualities and administrative duties, all of them should be taken into consideration when it comes to evaluation for individual researchers and institutions are all important points to take up. I think this is a recorded conversation. So I believe INYAS has a role now to put them all together. And as Professor Hasan said, having institutionalized mechanism for various stages of evaluation in a career and for various sectoral fields is also very important. I think there is a way forward and action for us to take it together when it comes to responsible research evaluation in this country. With that, I hand it over to Dr. Sharma, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to engage in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chagun. I think you very nicely moderated the session, and I am happy that INYAS has brought this important discussion today. So I really thank all the panelists to contribute to this discussion. And I'm sure that because since it's a stream live and it will be available later also. So as you suggested, INYAS will definitely look into some of the action items from this discussion. So I now request Rajendra to formally conclude and close the session.
Okay, thank you, Chandra. So let me thank all panelists of this really important topic where we have discussed and touched upon many important, topics within this one topic. And I'm sure that in INYAS, we all will take this further, and this topic and the discussion will help all young researchers in future. And I also really thank Dr. Chagun from PSA office, who really moderated this session very nicely and concluded very nicely. So with this, I thank all of you, and we conclude this session and close here. We will meet all INYAS members. We will meet again tomorrow for INYAS general session. Thank you all.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Ramgopal Rao. Thank you, Dr. Deeksha. And yeah, finally, thanks, Chagun. Very nicely moderated. Maybe we can